head of each force, and then to eliminate things like the good soldier defense. And then those who feel like they have been discharged from the military or how their discharge has been described will now get an opportunity to have their case reviewed. So we're not only looking forward, but we're going to look backwards to make sure that victims of crime know that they will be treated with dignity and respect. I come to this issue as someone who was a prosecutor. I spent most of the cases...
We are on a quorum call. May I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted?
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And may I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 15 minutes?
Without objection.
Thank you. I'm back again for the now 51st consecutive week that the Senate has been in session to urge Congress to wake up to the effects of carbon pollution on the earth. And I'm here today to talk about how climate change is taking its toll on an important part of our way of life, some of our long-cherished American pastimes that we do in the great outdoors. New England is, for example, and the distinguished senator from Connecticut is very familiar with this. We have fond memories of ski trips in Vermont, of ice hockey on frozen ponds in New Hampshire, of fishing trips off the coast of Rhode Island. All of these activities are fun, they are fulfilling, and they leave us with indelible memories of the wonders of our natural world. But climate change is putting much of that at risk. The New York Times reported that declining snowfall and unseasonably warm weather were a drag on winter sports and recreational tourism during the 2011 to 2012 winter. Before the end of the century, they report, the number of economically viable ski locations in New Hampshire and Maine will be cut in half. In half. Skiing in New York will be cut by 3/4. And I'm sorry to say to the presiding officer from the great state of Connecticut that there will be no ski area left in Connecticut or Massachusetts. And I assume from the report that that means Rhode Island as well, because Rhode Islanders have been skiing our beloved Yawgoo Ski Valley since the 1960s. As drought and increasing temperatures reduce the snowpack in the Cascade Range and the Rocky Mountains, the future of ski and snowboarding there is also at risk. The Park City Foundation in Utah predicts an annual local temperature increase of 6.8 degrees Fahrenheit by 2075, which could cause a total loss of snowpack in the lower Park City resort area. Beyond the loss to the skiing tradition in Park City, the report estimates that this will result in thousands of lost jobs, tens of millions in lost earnings, and hundreds of millions in lost economic output. No part of the country will be immune from these changes our carbon pollution is driving. Studies have found that extremely warm days in the southeast are on the rise. Ice on the Great Lakes is forming later and disappearing earlier. Rain will continue to decrease on the Great Plains. Wildfire seasons are getting worse in the west, where the snowpack is melting earlier. Sea level rise threatens Hawaii's famed beaches, and warming in Alaska is degrading the permafrost that entire communities are actually built on. Climate change has already changed rainfall patterns and can load the dice for bad weather conditions like heat waves. This past summer, a heat wave prompted the Kenosha Public Schools in Wisconsin to cancel all outdoor student practices and sporting events. The district stated on its website, keeping the best interests of the athletes in mind, we are canceling, rescheduling all contests today. According to the Denver Post, this past spring, a prolonged drought forced the Denver Parks and Recreation to postpone opening of the grass sports fields for soccer and lacrosse, which kept thousands of children and adults from starting their athletic seasons. For some, warmer temperatures mean more time inside because the air is just not fit to breathe. Ground-level ozone, commonly known as smog, forms more quickly during hot, sunny days, causing asthma attacks, emergency room visits, and even hospitalizations. In August, I met with two Rhode Island kids. Nick Friend, he's a 15-year-old from East Providence, and Kenyatta Richards, who's an 8-year-old from Warwick. They have asthma. They have to stay indoors and avoid being too active on bad air days. We've had 6 bad air days from ozone this year in Rhode Island. That is 6 days when Rhode Islanders like Nick and Kenyatta can't enjoy the outdoor activities that are so much a part of our American childhoods. The effects of climate change aren't limited to hotter days and smog. Oceans are warming, ice is melting, and sea levels are rising. This puts coastal infrastructure like dams and bridges and coastal power plants at risk. But it also threatens many of our most beloved and expensive palaces of sport. As far back as 2007, Sports Illustrated ran a special issue on sports and global warming. Quote, scientists project up to a 1-meter increase in sea level by 2100, warned one article, which will alter the shape of the land in low-lying regions of the U.S., including San Francisco Bay and South Florida, and swamp well-known sports venues, end quote. Places like the American Airlines Arena and Sun Life Stadium in Miami and AT&T Park in San Francisco are at risk. As Congress sleepwalks through history, blind to the harmful effects of carbon pollution, responsible groups are acting, including our major professional sports leagues, NBA, MLB, NFL, NHL. They're letters that almost every American knows. These leagues and their teams are cultural institutions. They're also big business, with annual revenues in billions of dollars. They take the threat of postponed games and washed-out stadiums seriously. Earlier this year, the bicameral task force on climate change, which I started with Representative Henry Waxman to keep attention focused on climate change and what we could do to address it, we asked the National Basketball Association, Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, and the National Football League, as well as the United States Olympic Committee, to tell us what climate change means for their sports. Each of these organizations is awake to the dangers of carbon pollution, and each is acting. Baseball Commissioner Bud Selig wrote to the task force, I'll quote, "I've often said that baseball is a social institution, and to that end we recognize our responsibility to be part of the national effort to preserve our environment. And that is why MLB, Major League Baseball, and many of our major league clubs have adopted practices that have resulted in clean, energy-efficient ballparks and environmentally friendly baseball events. One of those practices is the partial offset of the energy used at all the All-Star Game events, including Fan Fest, the Home Run Derby, and the All-Star Game, by green, E-certified renewable energy credits, including wind and solar energy." On the hockey front, NHL Deputy Commissioner William Daley wrote, "Hockey's relationship with the environment is unique. Our sport was born on frozen ponds, where to this day players of all ages and skill levels learn to skate. For this magnificent tradition to continue, it is imperative that we recognize the importance of maintaining the environment." End quote. The NHL has partnered with Energy Star and the Natural Resources Defense Council to make its own facilities more energy efficient, and it has called on the U.S. government to develop a nationwide retrofit strategy to help upgrade buildings such as ice rinks and to reduce energy consumption and carbon emissions. Kathy Behrens, Executive Vice President of Social Responsibility and Player Programs at the NBA, told us this. Again, I quote, "While professional NBA games are played inside climate-controlled arenas, most basketball around the world is played outdoors. If air pollution, extreme heat, and other forms of climate disruption make it difficult to enjoy or attend our game, and of much concern actually threatens the health and safety of basketball players, fans, and business partners, that matters greatly to the NBA. Pro Basketball is working to reduce carbon emissions through improved energy efficiency at its arenas. A number of NBA arenas have achieved LEED certifications, and some have installed on-site solar panels. The NBA has also come out in support of standards to reduce carbon pollution from electric power plants, which is a cornerstone of President Obama's recently announced Climate Action Plan. On the football front, Adolfo Birch III, Senior Vice President of Labor Policy and Government Affairs for the NFL, wrote us, 20 years ago, the NFL became the first professional sports organization formally to address the environmental impact of our marquee events, Super Bowl and Pro Bowl. The program to reduce overall greenhouse emissions during every Super Bowl has resulted in the planting of more than 50,000 trees in the Super Bowl host communities. The National Football League estimates that the 2013 Super Bowl in New Orleans achieved a reduction of nearly 24,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions, or the equivalent of 8,000 American homes' energy use for an entire year. The U.S. Olympic Committee has also joined in the fight to reduce harmful carbon pollution. According to USOC CEO Scott Blackman, the Green Ring program aims to mitigate the USOC and our athletes' impact on the environment through a number of sustainability efforts, an area that is a passion for many of our athletes. Through Green Ring, we hope to contribute to sustainability while using our platform to educate and inspire our constituents to do the same. Our focus is more action, less carbon." End quote. Other international bodies have also launched aggressive plans to fight climate change. The 2014 Soccer World Cup in Brazil is aiming to be carbon neutral by offsetting 2.7 million tons of carbon dioxide estimated to be generated by this year's Confederations Cup tournament and the World Cup next year. Our major sports leagues thus join a great army amassing on the side of climate action. Virtually every major scientific body, the insurance and reinsurance industry, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Academies, NASA, and the Government Accountability Office, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, leading American and international corporations, and the American Public Health Association. To them and many others who are all in this fight, we can add our friends in the world of sport, Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, the National Hockey League, the National Football League, and the United States Olympic Committee. There is a growing chorus of voices from every sector of American society calling for action. And indeed, there is work to be done. The major sports organizations are doing their part because they know that few things define American society like the teams we cheer and the games we play. But we here in Congress need to wake up and join the fight. It is time to set aside the partisan nonsense and the polluter-fueled fantasies and at last take real steps to reduce our carbon pollution and preserve our distinctly American way of life. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, Senator from Pennsylvania. Mr. President, I'd ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
And I think preliminarily I know that there may be a Republican member who comes to the floor, and if that's the case, we can juggle our time as need be. But, Mr. President, I rise tonight to talk about the matter that's before us, which is the National Defense Authorization Act. And I don't think we have to make a fulsome argument tonight that it's very important we pass this Authorization Act for the fundamental purpose being that we have to make sure that we can, at a minimum, complete action in the very near future on authorizing a whole range of programs to keep our people safe and ensure our national security. So I'm confident we'll do that, but that's vitally important. And I rise tonight to talk about one aspect of that challenge, which is, and again, it's just one part of our national security interests, but it relates specifically to what's been happening in Afghanistan over the last decade, in particular to women and girls in Afghanistan. The amendment that I've introduced and will be speaking on behalf of tonight is amendment number 2172, which regards the security of Afghan women and girls. For the past 12 years, United States service members have been deployed in Afghanistan fighting the insurgency there. Their sacrifices, the sacrifices of our own people, have created the space for Afghan democracy to take root and civil society to develop. It's imperative that we draw down, that as we draw down U.S. combat troops in Afghanistan, that we remain focused on the United States' long-term strategic interests in the region. It's in the United States' national security interest for Afghanistan to remain stable, secure, and democratic. We've seen what life, we've seen it from a distance, but we've been able to observe what life under the Taliban looks like in Afghanistan today and over, or I should say when the Taliban were in charge. We also can see with the perspective of recent history what it's looked like since the Taliban were removed. A return to their rule, however, will not only set back the progress that's been made, but also will allow the forces of intolerance and extremism to triumph. 2014 marks a significant transition in Afghanistan. U.S. and coalition forces will draw down, while voters will go to the polls to choose their second democratically elected president. We're considering this year's National Defense Authorization Act with just 6 weeks remaining before the beginning of 2014. Our military families are welcoming back soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who have seen more than a decade of conflict in Afghanistan. Mr. President, when I meet, as I know the presiding officer and other members of the Senate do, when we meet with service members who served in Afghanistan, I must never forget, as none of us must never forget, their sacrifice, their determination, and their valor. Since October of 2001, Americans have fought for a stable, prosperous, and democratic Afghanistan. On my trips to Afghanistan, which I guess now numbers three trips there, I've come to understand that women and girls often display remarkable courage, but are often the most vulnerable targets. Great progress has been made, and I'll just mention a couple of examples. About a decade ago, almost no girls were in school in Afghanistan, very close to, if not at zero. The number of Afghan girls in school now is 2.4 million girls in school. Women represent more than 27% of Afghans serving in Parliament. A small but brave corps of women has joined the Afghan National Security Forces in service to their country. None of this would have been possible just a little more than a decade ago, 12 years ago. Whenever I meet with them, Afghan women emphasize that they are not willing, nor should they be, willing to give up on the gains that they have achieved. They've achieved with help from the American people. Just yesterday I met with Niloufar Sakhi, who is working to promote women in the workforce. And hearing her commitment to advancing the role of women firsthand, as I did yesterday, further motivated me to introduce and advance this amendment. During my last trip to Afghanistan, I met with Fauzia Kufi, who is an inspiring lawmaker and women's rights advocate. As a mother of 2 young daughters, she has worked to instill the importance of education and to make sure that her daughters understand that. She now serves in a leadership role in the Afghan parliament. And I would also mention, when we were meeting with her, she talked about how both her father and her husband had been killed because they were politically active. But even in the face of that, she has put herself forward to serve in public office in Afghanistan. A third example, another brave woman showing the people of the world what it means to serve and to act even in the face of danger. Soraya Paksad, who lives in Herat, recently traveled to the United States and visited not just my home state of Pennsylvania, but literally the county that I live in, and impressed people there as she always does. Soraya is a true entrepreneur and philanthropist. With U.S. government support, she's opened up a women's shelter in Baghdad province. And that's just the beginning of what we could say about her service. We don't have enough time tonight to give even more examples, but Soraya has been a great example to me and so many others. So these inspiring stories, just these 3 that I talked about, are just a few of the many. But I am deeply concerned, I know a lot of people are, that we've already begun to see the progress on Afghan women's rights and security be rolled back. Mr. President, in an effort to honor the sacrifice the American people have made to help women and girls in Afghanistan, I, along with Senator Ayotte, have introduced an amendment to this Authorization Act to ensure that those gains are not degraded. Again, the amendment is number 2172, and I'm grateful to Senator Ayotte for her work on this issue and for her leadership on this issue, because we know, and I think the evidence is as clear as could be, that the security of Afghan women and girls is not simply about their own security and the value and the importance of that. It's critically important to the long-term future of the country. We know that if more women and girls are not just allowed to be educated, to go to school and to learn and to grow and to achieve, that in and of itself has an economic impact, a positive impact on that, on a woman and her family, but also on the economy of Afghanistan. It's also, though, a question of the steps we're going to take to ensure not just their own security, but the security of the country. If they advance, if women and girls in Afghanistan advance, Afghanistan will be a safer place, literally have less of a terrorism threat because of the direct involvement of women in the economy and in the life of the people of Afghanistan. So let me just quickly summarize what the amendment does. First, it focuses on political transition. Afghanistan will hold, as I mentioned before, historic elections in April. As the country votes for a president that will help Afghanistan transition from conflict, it's critical that women not be disenfranchised. Therefore, this amendment seeks to ensure the adequate staffing of polling stations by female officers. Second, the other part of the transition, of course, is the security transition. This bill would also improve awareness and responsiveness among Afghan national security forces personnel regarding the unique challenges that women confront. It will also focus on the recruitment and retention of women in the Afghan National Security Forces. It would be, to use just one word, unconscionable to abandon the women and girls of Afghanistan who have made great progress, but if we take steps that lead to the abandonment of women and girls in Afghanistan during this transition, this drawdown, we would be making a terrible mistake. We would not honor the sacrifice of our own servicemen and women, and we would also be harming the important transition that's taking place in Afghanistan. So this legislation would demonstrate not just our commitment and dedication to this important goal, but it would also ensure a much brighter future, not just for that young girl or a woman in Afghanistan and his or her family, but will ensure literally a safer and more secure and a much less extreme situation in Afghanistan when we consider all of the threats that are present there on a daily basis. So I urge my colleagues to support in this authorization process Amendment number 2172, and I again want to commend and salute the work of Senator Ayotte on this very important priority for the United States. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my colleague from Pennsylvania, Senator Casey, for his leadership on Amendment 2172, which is very important. And I appreciate that what he just said on the floor, the cases of the bravery of Afghan women, the leadership that they have shown under tremendously difficult circumstances, and how the sacrifice that we have made to ensure that Afghanistan and our men and women have made in uniform to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a haven for terrorists again. And one of the keys to that is that no society can be free, no society can have true safety and security unless the women in the society also have safety and security. And I want to thank Senator Casey for his leadership of ensuring and standing by for Afghan women because we cannot succeed in Afghanistan if women go back to what they endured under the Taliban, which was horrific and was wrong, and none of us should accept. So he really has been a leader on this, and I thank Senator Casey for being so concerned about what will happen in Afghanistan to make sure that it never becomes a haven for terrorists again, but that women in Afghanistan can live with security and women and girls can go to schools and that they can contribute to the Afghan society to ensure that Afghanistan can have free elections, to have Afghanistan be a place where women will no longer be brought into soccer stadiums and violated. And so I want to thank Senator Casey for this amendment and bringing it forward, and I'm very proud to co-sponsor it. As Senator Casey talked about, what our amendment would do is would ensure that adequate staffing in polling stations by female officers when they have elections would improve the security of those stations to make sure that women can come forward and vote. Increase the awareness and responsiveness among Afghan National Army and National Police personnel regarding the unique challenges women confront when joining those forces. And yes, women are now, some of them are joining the Afghan forces to defend their nation. It would focus on improving the recruitment and retention of women in Afghan security forces, and it would ensure that as we enter the bilateral security agreement, that DoD will produce a strategy to promote the security of Afghan women and girls. And so these issues are very, very important. And our men and women in uniform, I want to commend them for everything that they have done in Afghanistan to prevent Afghanistan from being a haven for terrorists, to ensure that women and girls can live securely and won't be violated the way they were when the Taliban were in charge of Afghanistan, in ways that the images that so many of us saw were just beyond the word outrageous. We can't even describe the horrific way that women and girls were treated as worse than second-class citizens under the Taliban. And so this amendment will ensure what we all understand to be the bottom line, that no strategy in Afghanistan can succeed if women are not an integral part of that strategy, if women aren't allowed to have the security, the dignity, the freedom that all people deserve. And so I want to thank Senator Casey again for his leadership, and I hope that my colleagues in the Senate will adopt this amendment, because last year when we had the defense authorization, the Senate passed a similar provision by unanimous consent. And so I would hope today that my colleagues would do the same to pass the Casey-Ayotte amendment to promote the security of Afghan women and girls as we look to the bilateral security agreement, as we look to working with our coalition partners, as we are drawing down in Afghanistan. We will not leave the Afghan women and girls behind, and we will ensure that Afghanistan does not become a haven for terrorists again. So I thank you, Senator Casey, and I want to thank you, Mr. President, for allowing me to speak on this very important issue, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy with Senator Wyden of Oregon for up for 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I just want to pay tribute to my two colleagues, Senator Casey and Senator Ayotte, for their focus on human rights, and particularly the rights of women wherever those women may live. And I rise tonight to talk about the rights that are enshrined in our Bill of Rights. And to that particular key concern of Americans, I want to talk about the importance of reforming our domestic surveillance laws. And we, Senator Wyden and I, as we both enter this discussion, we have one general goal in mind, and that is to find the proper balance between keeping our nation safe from terrorism while still protecting our cherished constitutional rights. Senator Wyden and I are both members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and we have argued for years that the government's domestic surveillance authorities need to be narrowed. And we're going to keep leading this fight in the days and weeks and the months to come. And as a part of this ongoing effort, we recently introduced comprehensive bipartisan legislation that would end the NSA's collection of millions of innocent Americans' private phone records, shield Americans from warrantless searches of their communications, and install a constitutional advocate at the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. We believe that overly intrusive domestic surveillance programs, misleading statements made by senior intelligence officials, and revelations about how secret courts have handed down secret rulings on secret law have eroded the trust and confidence of the American people. Mr. President, simply put, we need to restore this trust. And the best way to do that is to carve out time and hold a vigorous and substantive debate here on the Senate floor, a debate the American people have demanded and they deserve. Mr. President, Senator Leahy, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, introduced his own comprehensive reform proposal last month with Representative Sensenbrenner. Representative Sensenbrenner is a key figure in all this because he was the original author of the Patriot Act. He has had concerns. He's joined forces with Senator Leahy. And this bipartisan plan, the Leahy-Sensenbrenner plan, includes many of the proposals that Senator Wyden and I have long called for, and we are proud to support this effort. So, Mr. President, let me be clear. This issue is not going away. It's not going to go away because more and more Americans and more of our colleagues are coming to understand the true overreach of our nation's surveillance programs and the effect on Americans' privacy. This issue is not going to go away because we're not going to stop shining a light on the potential for future abuse that comes with our government's secret interpretation of its authorities under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And I truly believe, Mr. President, I really do, that ultimately our efforts, the efforts of Senator Wyden, Chairman Leahy, Representative Sensenbrenner, Senator Paul, Senator Blumenthal, the presiding officer, and myself and a growing number of others will lead to a majority of this Congress acting in common sense ways to protect the privacy of Americans. Now, Mr. President, we're here today on the floor in the midst of a consideration of a very critical piece of legislation for our national security and for the well-being of our men and women in uniform, the Defense Authorization Act. I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee. I have the great privilege of chairing the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces. I know as well as anyone this is a must-pass bill. And the issues that we've debated here this week related to Guantanamo Bay and the scourge of sexual assault in our military are matters that rightfully demand significant and thoughtful time here on the Senate floor. And while I think Senator Wyden and I would agree that this week's debate on the National Defense Authorization Act is not the right time for a full, comprehensive debate on surveillance reform, I do believe it is the right time to begin that conversation. And Senator Wyden has introduced a smart, pro-transparency, pro-accountability amendment, and that amendment is the right place to start. His amendment is based on the work we've been doing for a number of years now, and that's why I'm a proud co-sponsor and a strong supporter. This amendment would increase the transparency of domestic surveillance programs, and I think it should have, and I know it will have, broad support in this body. I'm going to let Senator Wyden speak more extensively about our amendment, which, by the way, we also have introduced with the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Mikulski. But I want to just say again, this is the perfect way to begin and frame what will become a more fulsome debate over the next few months. We're going to demand that we have this debate because Coloradans and Oregonians and Americans across our country demand that we have that debate. With that, I'd like to turn to my friend and colleague, Senator Wyden, for his thoughts.
Thank you, Senator Udall, and thank you for your exceptional leadership in our effort to put together a comprehensive, bipartisan reform bill. And I also want to thank the distinguished president of the Senate, the distinguished senator from Connecticut, because as we all know, he has really been the ringleader in the effort to ensure that when there are arguments, major constitutional arguments, put in front of the FISA court, that there's somebody there to make the case for the other side. So I'm very pleased that for purposes of this colloquy, when we discuss the transparency amendment that we have filed today with Senator Mikulski, that we have Senator Blumenthal in the chair, because he has been an integral part of the reform effort. I also appreciate what the distinguished senator from Colorado has said about Chairman Leahy. We have had a real partnership with him on working on these issues for a long, long time. We were thrilled that Chairman Leahy went on our bill and we went on his bill, because it illustrates the need to try to make common cause around these issues. And as the senator from Colorado has said, we're talking about bipartisan approaches here that do help promote the reform agenda. And as the senator from Colorado noted, it would be pretty hard to have a full debate on this legislation about surveillance reform, and suffice it to say there are differing views here in the United States Senate with respect to surveillance. The senator from Colorado and I support a comprehensive, overhaul, particularly as it relates to the collection of millions and millions of phone records on law-abiding Americans, which come to be known as metadata. So we have supported restrictions on that in order to protect the law-abiding Americans who really have their privacy intruded upon. But having sat right next to the distinguished chair of the Appropriations Committee for many years on the Intelligence Committee, and I think my friend from Colorado sits on the other side. We have heard Senator Mikulski speak eloquently about the need for transparency and accountability, and my view is this is something that can bring together all senators around what really is a jump start to the later debates about intelligence reform. So Senator Udall and I, with the support of the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Mikulski, have put together an amendment, we filed it today, on this legislation that takes important steps forward with respect to transparency. The amendment we've offered requires that the executive branch answer some of the major unanswered questions about domestic surveillance authorities, and it would require that future court opinions that find that domestic surveillance activities have violated the law or the Constitution ought to be made public. They ought to be made public to the American people, and we've also recommended they be made public, and if there is some aspect of that that should be held back, what's called redaction, so be it. And under our proposal, the executive branch would have the authority, again, to make sure that no details about secret intelligence methods or operations were in any way divulged as part of this transparency effort. But while we feel strongly about protecting secret operations, we do not believe in secret law. The American people ought to always be able to find out what the government and government officials think the law actually means. To use a basketball analogy, and folks at home know that I'm always fond of those, parts of the playbook for combating terrorism will often need to be secret, but the rule book that our government follows should always be public. So this amendment presents a chance for senators who may have differing views about surveillance policy to rally together behind the cause of greater transparency. I'd also like to note at this time Senator Mikulski has filed an additional amendment that the senator from Colorado and I have co-sponsored. It would make the director of the NSA a Senate-confirmed position. This is a reform that Senator Mikulski has been advocating for years, and I think this, too, allows us to have a more vigorous and more open debate about these issues. And the reality is, Mr. President, the thousands and thousands of Americans who work in the intelligence field honor our nation day in and day out with their dedication and their commitment to the security of our country. But as the senator from Colorado has noted, too often in the past, too often, the leadership of the intelligence community has said one thing in private and another in public. And if our amendment that we put together with Senator Mikulski passes, there would be a new focus on transparency, and I think creates some very serious obstacles to those who might want to engage in the kind of deceptions that the senator from Colorado noted and we've seen in our hearings. I'd like to yield back, and we'll wrap up our colloquy here shortly.
Yeah, again, I want to thank Senator Wyden for his leadership and for taking the time to join me here on the floor. And as the senator pointed out, we've got a broad coalition across both parties and across the political spectrum. We also acknowledge that passing the Defense Authorization Act is crucial. We've got to keep our military strong in the face of limited resources and a security environment that's rapidly changing. That's why we're not offering a comprehensive bill today. But we're going to be back. We want to have a fulsome debate. This is a matter that my constituents have demanded that we address, and we're going to work to make this happen. And I, again, want to ask my colleague for any further thoughts he might have on this very important matter, because the rights is our biggest, baddest weapon, and when we stand with the Bill of Rights, we can't go wrong.
I thank my colleague. And first, let me just mention in closing that this bill is directly relevant to work done at the Department of Defense. As the NSA is an integral part of the Department of Defense. In fact, this bill already contains half a dozen provisions that affect the NSA in one way or another, so it has been our view that this amendment is clearly germane to the bill. It also directs the Comptroller General to conduct an assessment of the economic impact of recently disclosed surveillance programs. The fact of the matter is that surveillance policy doesn't just affect foreign relations, although clearly it does affect our foreign relations. We see practically every day accounts of how our allies are concerned about their relations with us because of questions with respect to whether the privacy of their citizens are affected. So when you're talking about allies, you're talking about partnerships we need to protect America in a dangerous world. And, of course, at the same time, you're talking about how in a fragile economy, some of America's leading companies, those on the cutting edge of our future, for example, with cloud technology that the distinguished President of the Senate and I have talked about. This is an area where Americans have a big, big lead. We don't want to fritter it away as we also suffer in terms of our national security, in terms of our relationships with allies. So there are high stakes here, and I'm very hopeful that we will have a chance to get a vote on this legislation. As I say, with Senator Mikulski, particularly the role that she has played as chair of the Appropriations Committee, I think we've got a chance to jumpstart the broader debate about intelligence. We've got a chance to set the record straight about some of the comments that the intelligence leadership has made in the past that are either wrong, misleading, or kind of shrouded in intelligence speak, this almost incomprehensible lingo that you try to sort through in terms of what they have to say. And I'm very hopeful that the Senate will want to join Senator Udall, Senator Mikulski, myself. I know Senator Blumenthal and others are interested in it, in taking the next logical, common step approach in terms of intelligence reform, and that is to come out foursquare for this approach, which I'd like to state does not ban any collection tool at all that is now used by the government, but it requires that there be basic transparency and accountability in how they're used. That is long, long overdue. And let me have my friend and colleague from Colorado wrap up and express to him how much I appreciate it. I note that somehow the presidency of the Senate seems to be passed from one supporter of intelligence reform to another, since the distinguished senator from Connecticut was just there. We've just been joined by Senator Heinrich, who's been a very valuable partner in these efforts as well. I want to thank him and allow the last word to
I thank the senior senator from Oregon, and you cannot go wrong with transparency. Transparency is a central principle of America, and that spirit I want to recognize the senator from Connecticut, Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my two colleagues who have led this effort well before I became involved, Senator Udall and Senator White.
The senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you. Have helped to lead this effort before there was any real disclosure about some of the excesses that have been so dramatically revealed over the recent past. And as a colleague in this effort, I want to thank them for their relentless courage in blowing the whistle, quite bluntly, telling America that there was something wrong, even when they couldn't reveal exactly what was wrong, saying that the American people would be outraged if they knew, if only they could be told. And that kind of bravery and strength has given energy and momentum to this debate. I am chagrined that we will not be debating and acting on it in connection with the National Defense Authorization Act. if the present circumstances prevail and amendments are limited. I do believe it is past time to be talking about and acting on these issues, to move for greater accountability and transparency. One of the amendments that I have sponsored would call for a more adversarial process to expose more of the truth before the judges who make these decisions through the appointment of a constitutional advocate. The hour is late today, and I hope at another time to talk about these issues in greater detail. But I want to simply say that the time now is more urgent than ever to confront and address these shortcomings in the present system. And I think the intelligence community itself will help us greatly and has recognized that all of America will benefit greatly, including their work. I want to salute the very talented and dedicated members of that intelligence community who have done their work literally in secret for so long, helping to save Americans around the globe from terrorism and other threats. And I think we need to change the system in ways that are worthy of the challenges they confront every day, and at the same time make sure we have trust and confidence in America, trust and confidence in the system, trust and confidence in both the need for and the tools and weapons we use to further American intelligence and the combat against terrorism. So again, I just want to thank my two colleagues who are on the floor today and tell them I look forward to working with them in the next few days. If it's possible to achieve these reforms, so be it. If not, we will continue the work. Thank you.
I thank the senator from Connecticut, the senator from Oregon, the presiding officers who's been engaged in this, and I know the senator from Arizona who's here is interested in these discussions as well. Thanks again. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, we're now at the halfway point in the countdown to the next budget deadline. By December 13th, the Budget Conference Committee has to report the plan for the remainder of fiscal year 2014 and beyond. We're already 2.5 months into the fiscal year. It's critical that the conferees agree on funding the government within the framework of the Budget Control Act. As I mentioned before on the Senate floor, the BCA, which places caps on discretionary spending, has provided us with a necessary dose of fiscal discipline. While the BCA is not a silver bullet that fixes all of our problems, it represents $2 trillion in projected deficit savings that improves the nation's long-term fiscal outlook. Without it, federal spending would go unchecked, allowing the deficits to be even higher. In 2014, the deficit reached $680 billion. In 2014, it's estimated to go up to $750 billion. Should Congress choose to ignore the BCA, we'll find ourselves even deeper in the red. In fact, some across the aisle have indicated that they want to spend a whopping $91 billion more than the BCA mandates in 2014 alone. Instead of offering smart spending cuts to eliminate waste and prioritizing funds, many are compiling a list of their favorite tax hikes to replace the sequester. Mr. President, that action fails to recognize one simple point, a point I made on the floor last week, and one that I will make over and over again. Washington has a spending problem, not a revenue problem. In fact, 2013 set a record for the most taxes ever collected, $2.77 trillion. That's a 13% increase from 2013. Yet some of my colleagues want taxpayers to shoulder the burden of their plans to increase federal spending. While the BCA has proved to help to moderate the federal budget's hunger for taxpayer dollars, make no mistake, this budget is still bloated. Anyone who says there's nothing left to cut simply isn't looking hard enough. Last week I offered my suggestion for cutting waste at the Department of Agriculture. Just the programs I highlighted, and there are surely others, would save $5 billion when compared with the President's budget. Today, I want to share with you some similar fiscal follies at the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy spends an astonishing amount of taxpayer dollars on industries and technologies that are already well established in the public marketplace. But a few examples stand out more as the agency's growing role, or no, few examples stand out more than the agency's growing role in the automotive industry. Take, for instance, the Vehicle Technologies Program, which is slated to receive $575 million under the President's 2014 budget. This program conducts research and development into seemingly every facet of vehicle manufacturing, from hybrid technologies to engine efficiency to advanced lightweight materials. It even goes so far as to draw up marketing strategies to promote consumer acceptance of products like electric vehicles and renewable fuels. Is there really anyone in America who doesn't know what an electric vehicle is or what it does? Yet we're supposed to spend money to improve consumer acceptance of these products. The Vehicle Technologies Program has also awarded hundreds of millions of dollars in grants to automakers, including Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors. Since 2010, the program has received $1.2 billion of taxpayer funds. Curiously, the Vehicle Technologies Program official online listing of goals and accomplishments has not even been updated since 2010. Another well-established industry benefiting from taxpayer largesse is wind energy. Don't take my word for it. Just read DOE's budget request, which prominently highlights wind industry's, quote, great success in deploying land-based technologies over the past 5 years, unquote. You may recall recently retired Energy Secretary Stephen Chu's admission that he considers wind a mature technology. Why then, Mr. President, are we pumping money into a technology that even DOE indicates should be able to stand on its own? A recent Navigant research study made headlines when it reported that the U.S. is both the world's largest wind market and home to the world's #1 wind power supplier, General Electric. A recent GAO report found that 82 federal wind-related initiatives funded across 9 agencies cost $2.9 billion in fiscal year 2011. This is for what we've been told is a mature technology. What's more troubling than the sheer cost of the federal government's fragmented wind program is GAO's finding that more than 80% of those programs have overlapping characteristics. GAO's subsequent recommendation seems reasonable enough that the DOE should formally assess and document whether federal financial support of its initiatives is actually needed. Yet the President's budget, released 1 month later, recommends an unprecedented funding level of $144 million for the DOE wind energy program just in 2014. Wind's windfall at DOE comes at the heels of yet another extension of the multi-billion-dollar wind production tax credit. This tax credit was temporarily established more than two decades ago to encourage investment in the then-fledgling wind industry. This is 2 decades ago. Congress gave energy a 7-year window to take advantage of and prepare for the expiration of the original PTC in 1999. Given 7 years. But, to the surprise of no one, parochial interests and a host of extensions continue to keep this zombie subsidy from expiring as designed. Today, as the credit supporters repeat their plea for just one more extension, they ignore America's debt-ridden reality. And so the walking dead wind production tax credit, which is little more than a taxpayer-funded entitlement program, lives on. While I've singled out automotive and wind programs at DOE, similar arguments could be made for reducing or eliminating the Department's support for other established industries, including oil, natural gas, solar, and nuclear. Many of these programs are both unnecessary for further development of these technologies and are blatantly duplicative. In fact, another GAO study identified a mind-boggling 679 renewable energy initiatives across 23 agencies in fiscal year 2010. Prominently featured in a report from my colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Coburn, these redundant programs cost taxpayers $15 billion just in 2010 alone. Instead of continuing to pick winners and losers, Congress needs to reduce its footprint in well-established areas of the energy sector. Not only would this help level the playing field for emergency energy technologies that are actually preparing to compete in the marketplace, it would save taxpayers untold billions of dollars. With just 1 month to go before the budget deadline, I urge my colleagues to reject the urge to fixate on raising taxes and instead help focus negotiations on smart, achievable spending reductions. By eliminating waste and prioritizing spending within the BCA framework, we can shore up this country's fiscal future. Turning out the lights on wasteful programs at the Department of Energy would be a step in the right direction. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.